27th, 1945. The Nazi military machine lies in ruins. The great cities of Germany, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, are wastelands of burning debris in the aftermath of Allied bombing. Hitler lies dead in his bunker, and the German military command is in chaos. Defenseless civilians flee the advancing Soviet armies. Across the Atlantic, Americans celebrate their victory in Europe as an inevitable triumph. But only a few years ago, these cheering crowds labored in fear of the worldwide dominance of fascism. With Hitler's armies triumphant on the ground, democracy fought for its survival in the air. This is the story of the air war over Europe, the planes and the men who flew them. The year is 1935. Hitler officially unveils his secret air force, the Luftwaffe. 11,000 men and 1,800 planes. It is a startling act of defiance. A key provision of the Treaty of Versailles prohibits Germany from building a military air force. But world reaction is strangely subdued. Germany had been developing bombers like the Ju-86 and the He-111, masquerading as commercial aircraft, though military potential was never far from the minds of their designers. Now the pretense is dropped. The Germans don't bother to conceal their plans to fly the Messerschmitt 109 as a fighter plane. They enter it in races. In 1937, it will break the world speed record at 379 miles per hour and send shockwaves across Europe. Hitler knows that supremacy in the air will be crucial to his plans. He orders a wide array of new aircraft, mainly fighters and medium bombers, to support ground units. Counting on short battles and decisive victories, Hitler decides against the development of a long-range strategic bomber, a decision that will return to haunt him. By 1936, Germany has the men and the planes, but it needs a proving ground to test them, a war it can borrow long enough to perfect new tactics and technologies. Unfolding events in Spain provide that opportunity, the Spanish Civil War. The Luftwaffe forms a special unit, the Legion Condor, to help the fascist General Francisco Franco and the right-wing nationalists overthrow the Spanish government. By November of '36, Germany has delivered 40 planes and 4,500 men to the Spanish rebels. One German general remarks that 2 years' war experience in Spain have proved more useful than 10 years' peacetime training. For one thing, the battle against the Loyalists gives the Nazis a chance to test the role of air power in a new form, blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Like a gathering storm, thunderbolts of aircraft are sent ahead of Franco's ground units to surprise Loyalist fighters. It proves devastatingly effective and leads to an unexpected discovery. Massive bombing of cities like Madrid and Guerra causes panicked civilians to jam the roads and highways of escape. The result? Military traffic is brought to a near standstill. The bombing of civilian targets becomes standard practice from then on. It is the added dimension of civilian terror which helps settle the debate over which is more deadly, dive bombing or level bombing. Level bombing is less accurate, but some argue that better bomb sites will improve its effectiveness. Dive bombing is undoubtedly more accurate, but it greatly exposes planes to anti-aircraft fire. The terrifying success of German dive bombers in the Spanish Civil War settles the argument, even making converts of the skeptics in the high command. Another lesson is learned from the Spanish Blitzkrieg. German bombers can operate with minimal losses if they are covered by fighter aircraft. The Luftwaffe will lose only 96 aircraft in the 3-year Spanish Civil War. But maybe the most important aspect of Germany's borrowed war is the dress rehearsal it provides for Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom are seeing action for the first time. The most successful ace to earn his wings in Franco's war is Werner Mulders. A brilliant fighter pilot, Mulders earns 14 kills in the skies over Spain. He's also a perceptive tactician. Mulders develops a new combat formation that proves much more effective than the old 3-plane system. In Mulders' Finger 4 formation, several groups of fighters fly side by side, each group consisting of 2 planes, leader in front and a wingman behind, covering the leader's back. Mulders is spurred to devise this formation by the speed and maneuverability of a new Russian fighter. Like Germany, the Soviet Union is using the Spanish Civil War as a testing ground for men and machines. The plane, the Polikarpov I-16, is flown by Russian pilots alongside the Spanish loyalists. A stubby little monoplane, nicknamed the Rat, the I-16 is a fair match against the early Messerschmitt 109s it encounters. But soon, the Germans send in more advanced aircraft, and the Soviet-backed loyalists surrender to Franco. The war is over. The Russians' hard losses spur them to start crash programs developing new war machines equal to the German invasion they fear is coming. But both the Soviets and the Germans know they are not yet ready for a fight. And as an astonished world looks on, the sworn enemies sign a mutual non-aggression pact. A pact neither Hitler nor Stalin have any intention of respecting. The treaty is advantageous to both sides. The Russians use the time to retool their factories to build modern tanks and warplanes. And the Germans now have a free hand to open up the Western Front, beginning with the invasion of Poland. Russia and Germany agree to split it right down the middle. And World War II is only days away. Privately, Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Hermann Goering isn't sure German forces are ready for war. But publicly, Goering is confident. "Leave it to my Luftwaffe," he brags. Events justify his boast. And Goering knows what his flyers will face in the coming days. A famous flying ace in World War I, he distinguished himself with 22 combat victories. In the 20s, Goering would rise quickly in the Nazi Party. As head of the Nazi stormtroopers, he was shot during the beer hall putsch that landed Hitler in jail. The injury left Goering addicted to morphine. When the Nazis rose to power in 1932, Goering became president of the Reichstag. His close ties to German industry provided Hitler with crucial money and political support. Goering's charisma and leadership skill earned him the title Field Marshal and command of the Luftwaffe. September 1st, 1939. More than 2,000 of Goering's planes line up across the border from only 463 Polish frontline aircraft. As dawn approaches, a trio of Junkers 87 Stukas bomb 2 railway bridges spanning the Vistula River, launching their attack 15 minutes before Germany's official declaration of war. World War II begins in the cockpit of a Stuka dive bomber. Nazi propaganda later claims that the Luftwaffe has destroyed the Polish Air Force almost entirely on the ground. The truth is, Polish pilots put up a valiant but futile fight against overwhelming odds. The Polish P-11 fighters could not compete with the faster Messerschmitt 109. 2 days later, Britain and France joined the war against Germany. But the cause is hopeless. The Polish Air Force is already collapsing, done in almost as much by the incompetence of its own officers as by the power of blitzkrieg. Polish generals keep their most modern bombers on the ground for 4 days after the German attack begins. Worse yet, anti-aircraft commanders fail to familiarize gun crews with the profiles of Polish planes. 1 in 3 air crews is lost to friendly fire. On the ground, Polish strategists are still committed to the use of cavalry in modern warfare. The men and horses are especially vulnerable to the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. The Stuka had seen limited action in the Spanish Civil War, where it proved its pinpoint accuracy. Screaming out of the skies in a near-vertical dive, a Stuka can hit its target within an amazingly small 30-yard radius. Stukas are deployed against Polish military and civilian targets alike, with such effectiveness that even the Nazis are surprised by its success. The Stuka is the airborne embodiment of blitzkrieg, a virtual swastika in the sky. Its inverted gull wings are designed to increase bomb clearance beneath the fuselage. But flyers soon discover that the plane's sinister profile terrifies soldiers and civilians. The plane's morale-crushing appearance is enhanced by the addition of a bone-chilling dive siren powered by a small propeller mounted to the undercarriage leg. By the end of September, Warsaw is in ruins. Stukas and other German aircraft fly free and unopposed across Polish skies. The Nazi juggernaut is loose. But it takes time for the war to build momentum. Almost 6 months go by without any significant offenses on either side. American newspapers call it the phony war. Finally, in April 1940, the standoff breaks. Germany invades Denmark and Norway. Denmark falls in a single day, Norway within a week. Next, the Nazi steamroller turns to Holland and Belgium, and Hitler's Western offensive officially begins. On May 14th, German bombers attack the Dutch port city of Rotterdam. The first shells collapse the city's main water line. Without water, firefighters can't put out the blazes lit by rivers of burning fat that gush from a bombed margarine factory. Old Rotterdam burns to the ground, and Holland surrenders the next day. Belgium is the next to fall. In one of the world's first major airborne operations, the Germans stage a daring raid on a key Belgian fort, the supposedly impregnable Eba-ne-Mael. 11 DFS-230 gliders, loaded with highly trained German troops, crash land on Eba-ne-Mael's roof. The astonished Belgians can barely muster a fight. The fort is surrendered within a day. The tactics of these early successes are seductively simple. First, the Nazis use the element of surprise to pound the inferior air forces, ideally while they're still on the ground. Whatever air power remains in these small nations is overwhelmed by the Luftwaffe's superior technology and the sheer weight of numbers. Finally, with enemy air forces out of the way, German dive and level bombers are free to hit major cities and transportation targets. Panicked civilians flee, congesting road and rail lines. Now at a standstill, the military transport and civil defense structures of these countries simply collapse. With the capture of Fort Eba-ne-Mael, the Germans now have a crucial gateway around France's famed Maginot Line. The Maginot Line, an enormous concrete and steel fortification running hundreds of miles along the French-German border. Built in the early 30s as a showpiece of defense architecture, it now stands as a monument to obsolescence. With Belgium in hand, Nazi troops simply outflank the line to the north and plow over the unprepared French forces. The best fighter the French Armée de l'Air has to offer is the Dawatin D-520, but few French fighter units have them. The bulk of French fighter planes are underarmed underpowered Morane-Saulnier 406 interceptors. The vastly superior Luftwaffe takes out dozens of French planes on the ground. But the French Air Force faces deeper problems than obsolete aircraft. Air Command has been divided up in such a way that planes are attached to individual army units, making it almost impossible to coordinate ground and air attacks. One French bomber pilot notes that air crews are being sacrificed the way one would pour glasses of water into a forest fire. The Nazi blitzkrieg sweeps across France, rising to a thunderous peak as the Wehrmacht nears the English Channel. The British Expeditionary Force has no choice but to evacuate to the French Channel port of Dunkirk. German bombers bear down on the beaches, and a few British and French soldiers are captured. Meanwhile, hundreds of ships, military and merchant, converge on the English Channel to boat lift the Allied troops to Britain. Hermann Goering brags to Hitler that his Luftwaffe can smash the retreating British and French armies without the assistance of ground troops. Here, Hitler makes his first costly mistake of the war. Trusting Goering's boast, he holds back his panzers and allows the Luftwaffe to handle Dunkirk. But air power alone won't do the job. 380,000 British and French troops gain the time needed to evacuate to Britain, and the chance to fight again another day. Now defended only by the tattered remnants of the French army, France falls within 3 weeks, leaving Britain alone to face the relentless Nazi war machine. But while the Nazis are busy installing a puppet French government at Vichy and rearming themselves, the British have a chance to brace for an invasion which the Germans have codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Knowing an invasion is imminent and ignoring the hopeless odds against winning, the British make the best of Germany's 6-week lull. Production of England's 2 principal fighter planes reaches a fever pitch as assembly lines crank out Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires. Both planes rely on the Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 inline engine, a design legend that will be used in many different aircraft throughout the war. The Spitfire's success covering the retreat at Dunkirk proved that it's a good match for the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt 109. It's almost as fast and a touch more maneuverable than the 109. The Hurricane, on the other hand, is a slower, heavier aircraft that is extremely vulnerable to German fighters. But this weakness is also a strength. The Hurricane provides a very stable platform for its 830 caliber machine guns. Some pilots prefer it to the Spitfire. The British decide to team up their fighters. The Hurricanes will fly against German bombers, and the Spitfires will cover the Hurricanes. This tactic helps Britain achieve parity with German forces. But England has to do better if it is to stave off Nazi domination. 2 technological breakthroughs come just in time. The first is a lucky break. Just before the war, 2 Polish mathematicians succeed in cracking the secret behind the Nazis' mysterious coding machine, Enigma. They create their own code-breaking computer and hand it over to the Allies, who use it throughout the war to outmaneuver the Germans time and again. But the importance of another technology cannot be overstressed: radar. In the days preceding the first Nazi strike on Britain, Royal Air Force commanders rely on radar stations to provide valuable early warning both to anti-aircraft batteries and to RAF fighters. July 1940. Goering once again assures Hitler that his now refreshed Luftwaffe can break the Royal Air Force unaided and pave the way for Operation Sea Lion. Seemingly invincible, the German Air Force now faces a challenge that will test its technical superiority. The Battle of Britain begins. But German bombers are not well suited to the job. Facing modern opposition for the first time, the Stuka dive bomber suffers catastrophic losses in the opening rounds, 20% overall, and is withdrawn from the battle. Performing almost as poorly are the Junkers 88, the Heinkel 111, and the Dornier 17. Germany continues to manufacture these twin-engine level bombers almost exclusively, partly because they are faster to develop and cheaper to produce than an effective 4-engine heavy bomber. But with only 2 engines, these bombers have neither the range nor the speed to outrun Allied fighters. Nor do they have the power to carry adequate defensive fire. The Ju-88 has only 6 machine guns, the HE-111 only 3. The Dornier 17 is about 100 miles an hour slower than a Spitfire. So all 3 bombers must rely heavily on fighter cover to avoid being pasted by the RAF. But the Luftwaffe's fighter planes fare almost as poorly as the bombers they're assigned to protect. The Me-110 was originally designed to be the heavy fighter companion for a heavy bomber fleet that was never built. As such, it's slower and less maneuverable than British fighters, and after suffering heavy losses, it too is withdrawn from the skies over England. The Messerschmitt 109 is a fair match against the best Britain has to offer, as long as it can stay in the air. But based at airfields in France, 109s can spend no more than about 20 minutes in British airspace before depleted fuel tanks force them to flee back across the Channel. Many don't make it. For the first time, the Luftwaffe is facing a capable enemy defending its own turf. Unable to dominate the sky, Luftwaffe losses mount steadily. Perilous as the situation may be, the Germans have one important advantage: numbers. Germany's huge numerical superiority, both in men and machines, allows them to wear down the RAF in a war of attrition. Over 100 British pilots are lost in the first 2 weeks of August alone. The Germans concentrate on plane factories and airfields like Hendon and Biggin Hill. And by the end of the month, RAF planes are being destroyed faster than they can be replaced. The Royal Fighter Command is on the verge of collapse. Now comes an act of fate that changes the course of the battle entirely. On the night of August 24th, off-course German bombers accidentally dropped their payload on a civilian target, London. Britain swiftly retaliates by bombing Berlin, breaking Goering's promise that the German capital could never be hit. An outraged Hitler vows to erase British cities from the map, starting with London. Now, civilians bear the brunt of the battle as the Luftwaffe begins massive day and night bombing raids over London. Londoners are on constant alert for the wail of the air raid siren, driving them to the safety of the subway bomb shelters. They emerge the next morning to find smoking rubble where their homes once stood, and hundreds of their neighbors dead. This is life under the Blitz. But ironically, civilian bombing only strengthens Britain's hand. The RAF now gets the break it needs. With the pressure off military targets, Britain refreshes its pilots, rebuilds its factories, and repaves its airfields. With its newly improved Spitfire Mark II, the Royal Air Force returns from the brink of destruction and pounds the Luftwaffe without mercy. On September 15th, Britain downs 56 German planes, 1/4 of that day's invading force. 2 days later, Hitler admits defeat. The Luftwaffe switches to a lighter bombing schedule, and Operation Sea Lion is postponed indefinitely. Hitler now turns his attention to the east. The Russians are, of course, aware that the Germans are allies of convenience only. After all, Hitler has written that Russia's natural resources are the key to German prosperity. The Soviets anticipate a Nazi invasion in about a year. Hitler appears to have his hands full with the Battle of Britain, and Russian commanders estimate that they have about 12 months to tighten their defenses. In fact, by May 12th, over 90% of Luftwaffe bombers have been moved from France to the east. Russian commanders are so stubbornly unprepared that when British leaders frantically warn of an impending German invasion, Soviet newspapers dismiss the intelligence as the ravings of Russia's enemies. The result, the Russians are caught completely off guard when Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, 1941. Once again, Nazi commanders follow the doctrines of Blitzkrieg. German bombers race out ahead of the main ground forces, aiming for immediate command of the air. Stunned Soviet pilots watch helplessly as their I-15s and I-16s are blown up sitting on their airfields. The Russians do enjoy a huge numerical advantage. 9,000 aircraft on their western border against only 1,400 combat-ready German planes. But 4/5 of the Red Air Force is obsolete. And with the advantage of surprise, the Germans managed to take out 3,000 Russian planes in only 10 days. Operation Barbarossa now moves into its ground phase. Panzers blast away at Russian tanks with the Luftwaffe providing tactical support. But unfortunately for the German fighting men, Barbarossa is late in starting. In April, Hitler had diverted planes and panzers to help the Italian invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. By the time Germany attacks Russia in June, Soviet generals are able to stall the Nazis long enough to enlist their great historical ally, winter. The first snow falls in early October, turning roads to mud. Soon the freezing Russian winter brings Luftwaffe operations almost to a standstill. Nazi deployment capability plummets with the temperature. At 50 below, most German war machinery is inoperable. The Soviets, on the other hand, are trained and equipped for the bitter cold and begin a counteroffensive in the dead of winter. They also seize the opportunity to mount one of the greatest feats of logistics in military history. The Soviets crate and ship almost their entire defense industry more than 1,000 miles east, beyond the Ural Mountains and out of German bomber range. In 5 months, 1,360 munitions plants alone have been moved eastward in 1.5 million freight carloads. Aircraft factories are thrown up in days, churning out planes before the roof is even up, in temperatures down to 40 below. Now the German planners realize the error of their ways. The shortage of 4-engine heavy bombers was a hindrance for the Germans in the Battle of Britain. On the Eastern Front, it is a disaster. The Luftwaffe is unable to hit the distant Soviet factories, and dwindling German reserves face a freshly supplied Red Army. By December of '41, the Germans are down to 500 planes on the Central Russian front, while the Soviet Air Force has massed more than twice that number around Moscow alone. To make matters worse, German logistical resources are stretched to the limit along the 2,100-mile Eastern Front. Wehrmacht ground units are frequently encircled and cut off by Red Army forces, requiring massive supply airlifts by the Luftwaffe. Then, on the other side of the globe, a fatal card is played. December 7th, hundreds of Japanese bombers and Zero fighters attack and sink more than half the American battleship fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor. The U.S. joins the war on Japan and Germany, permanently shifting the balance of power in World War II. America's entry into the war brings massive aid to U.S. allies. President Roosevelt steps up delivery of weapons begun in March under the Lend-Lease Act. Aid to Russia, delivered through Alaska and the Middle East, includes thousands of Bell P-39 Airacobras. The Airacobra sports an unusual design. Its engine is mounted behind the pilot. The U.S. Air Force regards its underpowered engine and heavy armor as unsuitable for its designated role as an interceptor. But the Russians love its thick armor plating and easily aimed nose-mounted cannon. They immediately put it to use as a tank buster. Of the 9,000 Airacobras built in the U.S., more than half are delivered to the Soviet Union. The Red Air Force supplements the P-39 with its own anti-tank plane, the new Ilyushin-II Stormovik. The entire forward fuselage of the Stormovik is an armored shell, and the plane is known for good reason as the flying tank. The Soviets continually improve the Stormovik's armaments to keep pace with the increasingly tough German tanks. The IL-2 will end up with 2 cannons, 3 machine guns, and air-to-ground rockets. More Stormoviks are produced than any other plane of the war. Soviet factories will turn out more than 41,000 by armistice. The Luftwaffe also needs a tank buster on the Eastern Front, and it hopes to put the new Me-210 on the job. Complete redesign of the Messerschmitt 110, the 210 suffers from severe aerodynamic problems, leading to an epidemic of crashes. Only 200 are ever built. With the failure of the 210 project, the Germans have no choice but to adapt the dependable old Stuka for the job of tank buster. The obsolete dive bomber is fitted with more armor and underwing cannons. But the Stuka is a relatively slow and easy target for the rebuilt Russian Air Force. Its fearsome reputation so diminished that Nazi designers don't even bother to install the Stuka's distinctive dive siren. Still, the Stuka is one of the linchpins of Germany's last, best hope to turn the tide of war, the battle for Kursk. The Soviet recapture of Kursk created a bulge on their central front that was practically an open invitation for a German pincer counterattack. On July 5, 1943, the Nazis launch Operation Citadel. It will be the biggest tank battle of the war. The Germans opened with a blitzkrieg-style attack using 1,800 aircraft. Famed Stuka ace Hans Ulrich Rudel takes out an entire company of 12 Soviet tanks single-handedly. But the Germans are unaware that Soviet officers have received advance intelligence on their attack. 2 million men, 6,000 tanks, and nearly 2/3 of the Red Air Force are dug in at Kursk, prepared for the German attack. Nazi losses mount, yet they make almost no headway. Finally, against Hitler's orders, General Fritz von Manstein orders a retreat, and the last German push on the Eastern Front collapses only a week after it begins. On the Western Front, the famed American B-17 bomber, Memphis Belle, is just now finishing up the last of its 25 missions with a raid on the German naval base at Wilhelmshaven. Belle Captain Robert Morgan and his crew are the first to complete a full rotation. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in Britain, has been flying raids over Europe for almost a year. But serious, concentrated American raids on German soil are only now getting underway in July of '43. The first token raids by American bombers the previous year concentrated largely on German submarine bases and shipyards. Then, in November of '42, concerted attacks on German industry were further delayed by the diversion of parts of the 8th to Operation Torch in North Africa. It isn't until January of '43, more than a year after America's declaration of war, that the first U.S. B-17s pound a target on German soil. Boeing aircrafts designed for the B-17 is 8 years old by 1943, but it's still the mainstay of the U.S. bomber force in Europe, a role it will hold to the end of the war. The B-17's 4 engines give it enough power to lift a massive bomb load, 8,000 pounds, over a considerable distance, more than 1,100 miles. The Wright Cyclone engines also provide enough lift for 10 50 caliber machine guns and a crew employed solely to operate them. The B-17 lives up to its nickname, the Flying Fortress. The Fortress has a long-range heavy bomber stablemate, the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The Liberator can carry a somewhat greater bomb load than the B-17 and has a range great enough to hit any target in Germany. But its highly complex construction makes it somewhat fragile under fire. Many air crews prefer the older but incredibly rugged Flying Fortress. By the summer of '43, the British Isle is pocked with scores of airfields built to support the growing armada of 8th Air Force bombers sent from the States. Prime Minister Winston Churchill describes Britain as an island aircraft carrier. British and American Air Forces have officially divided up their workload. The Royal Air Force continues its safer but less precise nighttime bombing raids, while the U.S. Air Force pinpoints industrial and military targets during the day. American pilots quickly discover that the Germans are well prepared for these daylight runs. Long accustomed to the sight of a Messerschmitt 109, these airmen now face a new, more menacing profile, the Focke-Wulf 190. Fitted with a 1,700 horsepower BMW engine, the 190 is blazingly fast. And even at speeds over 400 miles an hour, it remains highly maneuverable. One of the best conventional German fighters of the war, a 190 is a tough target for American gunners. But the lumbering Allied heavy bombers make excellent targets for the 190, now nicknamed the Butcher Bird. Fighters like the 109 and 190 make it tough for American bombers. A daytime raid on the Romanian oil refinery at Ploiești ends in disaster when 1/3 of the planes and 310 crewmen are lost. Things get worse in August when 376 B-17 bombers head for the ball-bearing plant at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg. Their P-47 fighter escorts have limited range and have to peel off early. As soon as they do, German fighters descend on the bombers, beginning the fiercest air battle in Western Europe thus far. In the end, 60 flying fortresses are shot down and 100 more badly damaged. 1 in 5 crewmen dies. As the bloody summer of '43 closes, the 8th Air Force is forced to suspend all bombing runs to Germany for 5 weeks. A frantic search begins for methods to better protect these long-range bombers. One approach equips some of the bombers in each formation as defense fighters, with additional guns and huge quantities of ammunition. The theory is that unsuspecting German fighters will treat these wolves in sheep's clothing as ordinary B-17s, only to find a much pricklier opponent. But German pilots see through the ruse. 2 more effective solutions are proposed and immediately put in practice. The first is the use of a new bomber formation, the closed box, in which roughly 18 planes fly in close-set squares to cover each other's flanks. Another innovation is the Chen-mounted gun turret. German fighters know that the B-17 is vulnerable to a head-on attack, but the new B-17G has twin 50 caliber machine guns installed under the nose that the plane's bombardier operates by remote control. Now better equipped and better defended, U.S. bombers set out on October 14th to take a second crack at Schweinfurt. Once again, German fighters swoop down on the B-17s as soon as their fighter escorts abandon them. A desperate battle rages for miles across the German skies. In the end, 60 American bombers are lost, and only a third of the U.S. force returns to Britain unscathed. American pilots remember the day as Black Thursday. American commanders indefinitely suspend day raids over Germany until a new long-range fighter escort can be delivered. Until then, the Luftwaffe retains superiority in the air. By the fall of 1943, preparations are well underway for the Allied invasion of France, codenamed Operation Overlord. The buildup of troops and equipment in southeast England is massive, but Allied precautions keep it top secret. Meanwhile, Allied bombing over Germany resumes with much greater success, as long-range fighter escorts begin to reach the 8th Air Force in greater numbers. P-47 Thunderbolts have now been fitted with 200-gallon pressurized drop tanks that double their range to 1,100 miles. As D-Day nears, the Thunderbolt is reconfigured again. Hundreds are armed with bombs or rockets for use as ground attack planes. Air superiority is crucial in Allied plans to retake Europe and crush the Third Reich. Months before the planned June invasion, bombers take off round the clock to hit railway centers in northern France. Germany must be prevented from bringing up reinforcements once the Allied troops hit the beaches. But the extensive advance bombing is carefully planned so as not to reveal the actual site of invasion. The Allied plans involve a complex series of deceptions, including a phantom army, fake radio traffic, and dummy installations, all intended to convince Hitler that the invasion will come at Pas-de-Calais, north of the actual invasion site at Normandy. Decoded Enigma messages show that Hitler has fallen for the ploy. June 6th, 1944. D-Day begins in the early hours after midnight, when airborne troops are dropped behind enemy lines to secure bridges and protect the morning invasion force. Now making its way across the English Channel is the greatest armada of warships ever assembled, accompanied by the drone of over 10,000 aircraft. RAF and American bombers pound German pillboxes incessantly as Allied landing craft empty troops onto the beaches. Endless rows of Allied fighters patrol overhead, smothering any counterattack by German fighters. Nazi bombers can barely get within miles. German commanders plead for reinforcements. Hitler refuses, stubbornly insisting the real invasion will come to the north at Pas-de-Calais. Within a week, Allied troops secure the beachhead. British and American aircraft have flown 49,000 missions and dropped twice as many bombs as fell on Britain in all of 1941. But the breakout from the French farm country toward Paris is longer in coming. A month after D-Day, more than 1 million men are still bottled up near the beaches. The German lines must be broken, and the U.S. 9th Air Force is sent in to do the job. The 9th relies heavily for ground support on a mainstay fighter, the P-38 Lightning. Built by Lockheed, the Lightning has an odd twin-boom design. The Germans call it the fork-tailed devil. Early models lack maneuverability, but rugged twin Allison engines give the Lightning exceptionally long range. Lockheed designed the P-38 as a high-altitude interceptor. By D-Day, they've adapted it for ground attack, as well as photo reconnaissance, night fighting, and other jobs. In late July, the P-38 helps heavy bombers of the 9th Air Force pave the way for an Allied breakout, with massive carpet bombing of German positions at Saint-Lô. Confusion about targets causes heavy casualties on both sides. But U.S. ground troops are still able to break through the German lines, then wheel around and crush the encircled Nazi units. The race across France is on. At this crucial moment, an attempt on Hitler's life gives the Allies an important advantage. Though he escapes serious injury, Hitler becomes increasingly irrational. He begins firing and replacing his generals in France almost weekly. Allied forces make the most of the confused German leadership and advance across France nearly 50 miles a day. With each movement, combat engineers swiftly build advanced airfields using a new wire mesh that can be rolled out like carpet into runways. Now, with airfields finally on the continent, bombers have guaranteed fighter escort into Germany's industrial heartland. On Friday, August 25th, the Allied armies liberate Paris. The tide of war has turned. By September 1944, the battle for France is nearly won, but the Battle of Germany is only beginning. The Third Reich secures its last major victory in Holland, where the Allies drop airborne troops at the city of Arnhem, hoping to secure a bridgehead into northern Germany before winter sets in. But a swift counterattack by German panzers pins the paratroops down with no path for reinforcements. Of 10,000 British soldiers, 2,000 are killed. The Allies are ordered to retreat, ending all hope of winning the war before the new year. Though the Nazis win this battle, they are rapidly losing any hope of winning the war. The Luftwaffe is the only weapon left to protect the fatherland. Hitler finally permits bomber production to be cut back so that more fighter interceptors can be built. But with newly built airfields in France, waves of fully escorted 4-engine heavy bombers can pound German civilian and industrial targets day and night. Incredibly, in spite of the endless attacks, German fighter production actually increases in the final year of the war. Morale remains high, and the Nazis have cleverly decentralized military production, making it harder to target. Production lines that were once centered in large defense factories are now scattered among small workshops across the nation. By August of 1944, German aircraft production is at an all-time high. At the end of September, Allied Air Command finally settles on German fuel production as its main strategic target. U.S. and British bombers now focus on synthetic fuel plants and fuel depots instead of factories or military targets. The effects are immediate. In September 44, monthly production of synthetic gasoline drops to 7,000 tons, about 5% of demand. But Messerschmitt's venerable 109 is still in production, and Focke-Wulf continues to adapt and improve the 190, most recently as a high-altitude fighter dreaded by American bomber crews. And up until fuel shortages began to curtail production, the Nazis managed to maintain full-speed manufacture of two of the most innovative fighters of the war. The Messerschmitt 163 rocket fighter is brilliant in concept, but a failure in practice. The 163 is officially known as the Comet, though pilots call it the Powered Egg. It is first deployed in the autumn of '44 as a sentry for synthetic fuel plants. The Comet can rise toward its target like the rocket it is, but only carries enough fuel for 1 or 2 passes at most. Its landing skid is another problem. The Comet's jarring touchdown sometimes detonates its highly volatile fuel, obliterating plane and pilot. More 163 pilots die in accidents than in combat. The 163 eventually downs only 14 Allied planes, but its jet-powered Messerschmitt cousin shows much more potential. The Me-262 is the world's first fully operational jet fighter aircraft. It flies well over 100 miles an hour faster than anything the Allies can field. A sitting duck during takeoffs and landings, it is virtually unstoppable once it's in the air. At 540 miles an hour, it can't be caught in a straight chase. But luckily for the Allies, when the 262 is first shown to Hitler in late '43, he decides it should be developed as a blitz bomber. Carrying a 2,200-pound bomb load, the 262 is no faster than a conventional bomber. Finally, in October, General of Fighters Adolf Galland is able to persuade Hitler that the 262, now called the Swallow, should be used as a fighter. If that decision had come earlier, it might have affected the course of the air war. But with fuel stocks dwindling, the Me-262 is far too little and far too late. Nevertheless, in December of '44, the Germans press the 262 and every other airworthy plane they can find into service for a last-ditch attempt to regain control of their western front. Even obsolete Ju-87 Stukas are scraped up for an ambitious strike against Allied momentum. December 16th. The Germans throw everything they've got at the thin American lines near Belgium's Ardennes forest. U.S. troops fall back, and the spreading battlefront gives the offensive its nickname, the Battle of the Bulge. The next evening, the Luftwaffe launches its first nighttime paratroop drop near Liège to secure a key road against an American counterattack from the south. But within a week, the Allies send in 200,000 reinforcements, and Allied aircraft have complete control of the skies. Faced with certain defeat, Hitler orders a retreat. The last stand of the Third Reich is smashed. After turning back the Nazi resurgence in the Ardennes, the steady drumbeat of Allied victory grows deafening. German resistance on the ground begins to flag as Allied warplanes inflict punishing blows on Berlin, Chemnitz, and Leipzig. Spearheading these raids on the German heartland is arguably the best Allied fighter plane of the war, North American's P-51 Mustang. The Mustang's 950-mile range finally gives the Allies a fighter capable of escorting heavy bombers to virtually any target, including Berlin. Designers first equipped the P-51 with an Allison engine. Later, to improve speed and high-altitude performance, they substitute a Rolls-Royce Merlin power plant, making the Mustang easily a match for the German 109 or 190. The Mustang is also cheap and easy to produce, less than half the price of a Lightning or Thunderbolt. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 will roll off assembly lines. On February 13th, P-51s guide U.S. and RAF bombers, starting a three-day raid on the picturesque town of Dresden. 3,900 metric tons of bombs create a firestorm that vaporizes 12 square miles of the city. Estimates of the death toll range from 60,000 to 250,000. Bomber crews describe the city as a huge, smoking heap of debris. On March 22nd, Patton's Third Army crosses the Rhine into the German industrial heartland. April 16th, Allied Air Chief Karl Spaatz declares the strategic air war finished as the Soviets begin their assault on Berlin. April 21st, Hitler orders all Luftwaffe leaders to be hanged at once. The order is ignored. On April 30th, Hitler marries his mistress, Eva Braun, then shoots himself in his Berlin bunker. 1 week later, all armed forces of the Thousand-Year Reich surrender unconditionally. As the war in Europe now draws to a close, many Germans wonder how the mighty Luftwaffe, once deemed unstoppable, failed so utterly to defend the fatherland once its borders had been breached. Most obvious were the many mistakes made at the top by an incompetent leadership that made choices based on impulse instead of deliberate long-range planning. The commanders of the Third Reich grossly underestimated the industrial resources required to wage a world war. Efficient as it was, German industry had no hope of matching the seemingly bottomless capacity of the Allies. In the end, the Luftwaffe simply could not accomplish the gigantic task Hitler set before it. Brilliant technology such as the Me-262 jet fighter might have won the war for Germany if it had been deployed years earlier. Other aircraft were never deployed at all. The failure to develop a 4-engine heavy bomber not only hampered the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, it probably cost them the entire Russian front. Unlike the Luftwaffe, the Allies made great use of long-range heavy bombers. But they learned that those bombers needed long-range fighter escorts to be successful. Equipping the bombers with heavy armament was not enough. Allied commanders also learned that bombing had to be organized on a massive scale to be effective. Ironically, early German experiments in terror bombing, such as Guerra, returned to visit them 100-fold when the Allies bombed cities like Hamburg and Dresden. Perhaps the hardest lesson for both sides to learn was that air power alone is not enough. Air commanders from American General Billy Mitchell in the 20s through Hermann Goering and Britain's Bomber Harris during the 40s had been true believers in the supremacy of air power. They were firmly convinced that concerted bombing campaigns were enough to destroy the enemy's transport and industry and sap their will to fight. By war's end, it was clear that air and ground forces each had a crucial role to play in modern warfare. An air force can disable the enemy behind the battle lines, but ground troops have to capture and hold that territory. Today, it remains impossible to win a conventional war from the air alone. But in 1945, the power of an unconventional air war would soon be demonstrated. Not in Europe, but half the world away.